Now, while the pre-req classes do help you a lot for the MCAT, that doesn't necessarily mean that it helps you for medical school. I took classes in undergrad that I use way more often than some of those other prereqs. What is up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jordan, and I'm a second-year medical student in the state of New Jersey. In today's video, I want to talk about what pre-med classes actually prepare you for medical school. When you think of a pre-med, you probably think of a bio major. Makes sense. Medicine is the most related to biology. Why not be a bio major? However, some people don't understand that you can be whatever major you want and still go to medical school. I was a kinesiology major. We have English majors, business majors, philosophy majors, literally whatever you want. While you can be whatever major you want, the biggest thing to keep in mind is you need to take the prerequisite classes for medical school. Some schools are doing away with the idea of prereqs, but at least when I applied, most schools required general biology, sometimes cell biology, Gen Chem 1 and 2, Orgo 1 and 2, Biochem, Physics 1 and 2. Some schools required a stats class, psychology, sociology. So as you can see, it's a pretty long list. And I think that the reason that most pre-meds choose a bio major is because a lot of those classes are already wrapped up in the major. So they don't really have to worry about fitting extra classes in their schedule. For my major, we had to take Gen Chem 1, General Bio, and honestly, I think that's it in terms of medical school prereqs. It was not required to take Orgo or Physics or anything like that. So because of that, I did have to take a lot of extra classes on top of my own normal major. I had to take a few summer classes and winter classes to be able to fit everything in. And honestly, I didn't really mind it because I absolutely loved my majors. So don't let that discourage you from doing a major that you really love. The point of prereqs is to make sure you have the basic foundational knowledge for medical school. And honestly, more specifically than that, it's really for the MCAT. The MCAT covers topics from basically all of those prereqs that I listed previously. So it's a good idea to take most of those classes before you take the MCAT. Yes, you can self-study for some of the topics, especially like the psych and soc section. But for the really big topics like biochemistry, I really recommend taking an actual class before you do the MCAT. Now, while the pre-req classes do help you a lot for the MCAT, that doesn't necessarily mean that it helps you for medical school. I mean, I do think it's important to take these classes and have that base knowledge because yes, you still need to know how transcription and translation works in order to understand some medical school topics. But I took classes in undergrad that I use way more often than some of those other prereqs. Now, a big disclaimer before I get into the specific classes. This is my experience and my opinion. I'm not saying that you need to take these classes to be successful in medical school. Some of these classes might not be available to you, and that is completely fine. So right off the bat, if I had to make one recommendation for classes to take in undergrad that's going to help you in medical school, it would be anatomy and physiology. I really don't understand why these classes aren't at least recommended by medical schools to take before you come here. Like I said, the prereqs and the MCAT do have a lot of the foundational knowledge that you need to understand human physiology, but I just think it would make a lot of sense to have students take some sort of anatomy and physiology before they get here. While you do learn a lot of basic science in the preclinical years of medical school, the heavy focus is on anatomy and physiology. Even if medical schools aren't expecting students to know a lot about these topics before they get here, having them take those classes will at least make sure that they like them before they commit to going to medical school. Colleges do anatomy and physiology in different ways. My school had them combined. So we would have anatomy and physiology 1 and then anatomy and physiology 2. They were in just different semesters and it was like a progression. The first semester was some of the easier topics like the musculoskeletal system and hematology. And then the second semester was a little bit more complicated with cardio and renal. I know other universities will separate them, so you'll have one just anatomy class for a semester, and then you'll have a physiology class in a different semester. And you might even be able to take them concurrently, but like I said, my school did it differently than that. I absolutely love taking these classes. They were some of the best classes that I took in college, and it makes sense. I want to be a doctor, not a basic scientist, so I like anatomy and physiology more than cell biology and chemistry. I think it's pretty self-explanatory why I think these classes are so helpful for medical school. While you do go into significantly more detail and talk about pathophysiology in medical school, taking these classes in undergrad will make things so much more familiar. Even if you don't remember a lot from these classes, relearning things is a lot easier than learning them for the first time. If I had to pick one, I think anatomy might have been a little bit more helpful, just because in medical school, you learn so much more physiology and how it can go wrong as compared to anatomy. You do need to know the anatomy to understand the physiology, but like our anatomy block was only 7 weeks long. And physiology is just a much bigger topic, especially when you go into the details and start learning about diseases. I'd say I covered maybe like 50% of medical school anatomy in my undergrad classes, but probably only like 15% of physiology, especially when you start including pathophysiology. So moving on to the next class, there was this class at my undergrad that was colloquially known as the pre-med class. It was an upper level biology class called mammalian physiology, and basically every pre-med who was a bio major took it. I didn't have to take the class because I wasn't a bio major, but I still took it for pass-fail just because I was really interested in it. We called it the pre-med class because not only was it a physiology class, but it focused a lot more on pathophysiology when compared to like the basic A and P classes. So in that sense, it was probably the closest class to medical school that we could have taken in undergrad. We would learn about different spinal cord injuries and needed to know like what kind of paralysis or sensory issues it would cause. And it's really interesting to think back on that now that I'm in my neuro block, because we just learned about spinal cord injuries. Back in college, I thought it was so cool and interesting, but now I realize that we didn't even really scratch the surface and things are a lot more complicated than I thought they were. Now moving on to the next sort of group of classes that have helped me so much in medical school. As I mentioned, I was a kinesiology major, which is very similar to exercise science. So one of the core classes that everyone had to take was an exercise physiology class. This was a physiology class that focused on the cardiovascular, pulmonary, and musculoskeletal systems in the context of exercise. We reviewed the basic physiology and then explored how it changed under certain conditions. This included learning about different types of energy systems that our cells use, chronic adaptations of the cardiovascular system, and how muscles grow. This was a great review on those systems, but the biggest thing this class taught me was how to start thinking about how our body changes and responds to certain stimuli, which is a huge part of medical school. Even though this was isolated to exercise, I found that there was a lot of overlap between stuff we covered in medical school, like blood pressure and how oxygen is delivered through the body. Expanding on my experiences in this exercise physiology class, I took an upper-level exercise science class called Exercise and Disease Prevention. I was so excited to take this class just based on the title, and it did not disappoint. I love health and fitness, so this was the perfect class to blend those two topics. The class focused on 5 or 6 different diseases and then broke down how exercise can either help prevent or actually treat them. This was by far my favorite class I took in college. Even though I learned some pathophysiology in that pre-med class I mentioned earlier, this class was focused on specific diseases, and I learned about them in pretty great detail. The 2 biggest diseases we covered were atherosclerosis and diabetes, 2 of the most prevalent diseases in the world and huge topics in medical school. I got to learn about how these diseases developed, including patient risk factors and the complications. Then we learned about how exercise can help augment these processes all the way down to the biochemical level. For example, when we talked about diabetes, we learned that muscle contraction has an insulin-independent pathway for getting glucose into the cell. So that means people with diabetes can use exercise to treat themselves. When they exercise, they're going to have a bunch of muscle contractions, and it's going to help get glucose into their cell and bypass their insulin resistance, which is just incredible. We didn't even get into that kind of detail in medical school, which I'm not surprised about because there's so much to cover. Now I have so much more context about why lifestyle modification is so important for patients with diabetes. Because of what I learned in that class, I'm better able to counsel patients with diabetes and explain why exercise is so good for them. For the final sort of bonus class that helped me in medical school, I took an endocrinology class my junior year. That was actually taught by the same professor as that upper level pre-med physiology class. That professor's PhD was about cortisol, so I knew that her endocrinology class was going to be super comprehensive. In hindsight, I think it was a lot more detailed than we actually went into in medical school. The class focused a lot on like the biochemical pathways, which makes sense, it's being taught by a PhD. The focus in medical school was more on like clinical signs and symptoms and treatment. But regardless, it still sort of exposed me to a bunch of hormones that I had never heard about. Now, before I wrap up, I wanted to talk about a few classes that I wish I took or I think might be really good for people before they start medical school. The first one is a medical terminology class. I honestly don't even know if my school had one. If they did, I probably would have taken it. Medicine is its own language, and having sort of a background on the common words we use will make learning more efficient and smooth. I thankfully learned a decent amount of medical terminology from being a medical assistant, but I worked in dermatology, so a lot of it was derm specific, which is not really relevant for medical school. I think having more general vocabulary would have been even better, so if you have a chance to take a medical terminology class, think about it. The next one might be a little bit biased because of the block that I'm in, but I think an upper level neuroanatomy or physiology class would be really helpful. In all the anatomy and physiology classes I took, neuro was never an emphasis, and probably because of how complicated it is. I would say that the current block I'm in has had the steepest learning curve just because I have the least experience with this material. Neuro is one of the most complex topics in medical school, so if you have a chance to take a class on it, consider it. And the final one might be a bit of a curveball, but I think some sort of communications or public speaking class would be so helpful. While the preclinical years of medical school is focused on just studying and it can be a little bit isolated sometimes, that's all going to change once we start clerkships. And unless you're like a pathologist or a radiologist, your whole career is going to be centered around talking to people. One of the biggest parts of rotations and academic medicine in general is learning how to present your patient to the care team, which means you have to get up in front of a bunch of people. And when you're a medical student, it's all your residents and attendings, so your bosses. And you have to give an oral presentation, including the history, physical, labs, and then your assessment and plan. That can be very nerve-wracking, especially for people who don't like public speaking. And another part is just simply communicating with others. It doesn't matter how smart you are, if you can't effectively communicate with your patients or your colleagues, you're not going to be a good doctor. Being able to take complex topics and make them digestible for your patients is a key skill for a physician. And I think a communications or public speaking class might give you the tools to learn how to do that faster. All right, well, that is it for the classes I recommend before you start medical school. Like I said, this is not an exhaustive list, and it's just my personal experience. I'm sure there are other classes out there that are super helpful for medical school. Don't think that you have to take any of these classes, but if you have the opportunity, you can fit stuff in your schedule. If you can take something as an elective, I think it would help you out. All right, well, that is gonna do it for today's video. If you enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like below and subscribe if you wanna see videos like this in the future. Thanks, and I will see you in the next one.